Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. This time we're getting really specific and zooming in on one very cool creature, the Bay Island Anole. You might be thinking, a whole deep dive on just one lizard. But trust me, this little guy is way more interesting than you might think.
That's right. And actually, by looking at this one specific species, we can learn a lot about anoles as a whole, which scientists are really fascinated by.
Okay, now you've got me intrigued. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the Bay Island Anole, can you give us a little background on anoles in general? What makes them so special?
So imagine like a whole family of lizards that are so adaptable. They've evolved to fit into pretty much every ecological niche you can think of.
Yeah.
And that's what makes anoles so interesting. They're a perfect example of something we call adaptive radiation, where one ancestral species branches out into tons of new species. Each one is uniquely adapted to its own environment.
So kind of like Darwin's finches,
Yeah.
but with lizards.
Yes. Exactly. We'll get into like all the details of adaptive radiation a little bit later. But it's one of the main reasons why studying anoles is like having a front row seat to evolution in action.
Wow. Okay,
Uh-huh.
that really puts things into perspective. So
I-
let's zoom in on our star for today, the Bay Island Anole. What's the first thing people should know about this little guy?
Well, for starters, it wasn't even recognized as its own distinct species until 1996.
Wait, really? That recently? It's
Hmm.
not every day we discover a whole new species.
And it really shows you how much we still have to learn about the natural world, even in places that seem really well explored.
That's so cool. Okay, so I need to know, what does this newly discovered species look like? Paint me a picture.
The male Bay Island Anole is a sight to behold. Imagine vibrant emerald green, sometimes even with like a hint of electric blue. Quite a striking contrast against the forest backdrop.
Wow. That's way more colorful than I was expecting. What about the females? Are they just as flashy?
The females are a bit more understated. They tend to have more muted tones of brown and gray, which helps them blend in with their surroundings.
Ugh, camouflage. Smart move. Especially in a rainforest environment where there are predators lurking about, so they're not really going for the stand out in a crowd approach, huh?
Not quite. But the males definitely have their own way of getting attention. They have this amazing feature called a dewlap, which is basically a flap of skin under their throat.
Okay, I've heard of dewlaps before, but I always picture them like, I don't know, like inflatable pouches or something?
They can definitely puff them up, but it's more than just like an inflatable pouch. They use it for communication. The males will like flash and extend and even vibrate their dewlaps to send signals to rivals or even potential mates.
So it's like their own form of sign language. It makes you wonder what they're saying to each other.
It's definitely a complex communication system,
Yeah.
and we're still trying to figure out all the nuances of it, but we do know that dewlap displays play a key role in their territorial behavior and also in courtship.
Speaking of territory, I'm curious about where these anoles actually hang out. What kind of habitat do they call home?
The Bay Island Anole is perfectly adapted to the lush tropical forests
Yeah.
and coastal vegetation of the Bay Islands. So think like dense foliage, towering trees, just a really rich diversity of plant life.
So are they strictly tree dwellers? Or do they ever venture down to the ground?
They're primarily arboreal, which means they spend most of their time in trees and shrubs, but they've also been known to adapt to gardens and plantations, showing just how resilient they can be in the face of habitat changes.
Ah, so they're adaptable little creatures. And what about their,
Yeah.
superpowers?
Mm.
What makes them such skilled climbers in these kind of complex environments?
That would be their adhesive toe pads. It's like they have built-in climbing gear.
Okay, wait. Now I'm picturing tiny little lizard shoes with suction cups. Am I way off?
Not entirely. Their toe pads are covered in these microscopic hairs called setae, which create these van der Waals forces that allow them to cling to almost any surface.
So it's not suction, but some kind of molecular magic.
Ah.
That's incredible. It sounds like the Bay Island Anole is perfectly suited to its rainforest home. They really do sound like they've got the whole tree living thing down pat. But a lush rainforest isn't just about pretty scenery, it's a whole ecosystem. So where does the Bay Island Anole fit into all of that?
Well, they actually play a really important role as insect predators. You can kind of think of them as these tiny guardians of the forest, helping to keep insect populations in check.
Okay, so I'm picturing them like miniature superheroes, patrolling the rainforest canopy. So what's on the menu for these little guys?
Their diet is actually pretty diverse. They'll eat anything from ants and beetles to spiders, and even the occasional small frog.
Wow, quite the adventurous palate for a little lizard.
Yeah.
What makes them such effective hunters?
Well, they have incredibly sharp eyesight, so they can spot even the tiniest insects from a distance. And they have these lightning-fast reflexes that help them snatch prey, like in the blink of an eye.
So they're like the ninjas of the lizard world. Silent, agile, and deadly.
That's a great analogy. Their hunting techniques are truly fascinating.
You mentioned adaptive radiation earlier. Can you
Huh.
unpack that a little bit more? It sounds like a pretty complex concept.
Yeah, it is. But it's really key to understanding just how diverse and successful anoles are. It's like nature's grand experiment in evolution.
Okay, I'm all ears. Break it down for me.
So essentially, adaptive radiation is when you have a single ancestral species. That gives rise to a whole bunch of new species, each one adapted to a specific ecological niche. It's like taking a basic blueprint and then modifying it to create all these specialized tools for different tasks.
Are you saying that all 400 plus species of anoles
Divine.
evolved from one common ancestor?
Exactly. Over millions of years. Anoles have diversified to fill this huge array of ecological roles. Some are specialized for living high up in the canopy, others are adapted to life on the forest floor, and some have even adapted to aquatic environments.
Wow. It's kind of mind-boggling to think about the sheer variety that's evolved from a single lineage. It really makes you realize how powerful evolution is as a force of nature.
It really is. And the Bay Island Anole, with its unique adaptations to its island environment, adds another really fascinating chapter to that evolutionary story.
Speaking of stories,
Hmm.
I'm curious about the Bay Island Anole's social life. We know they're territorial, but what about their interactions with each other? Do they have any interesting behaviors or rituals?
They do, and one of the most fascinating is their territorial displays.
Ah, yes. The famous dewlap displays. Can you tell us a bit more about how those work?
It's kind of like a combination of semaphore and a dance-off. Males will puff out their dewlaps, extend them, bob their heads, and even do push-ups, all to signal their dominance or attract a mate.
So it's a whole performance. Do they ever actually fight, or is it mostly for show?
Most of the time, it's just a display of strength and intimidation. But if a rival doesn't back down, things can escalate to actual physical combat.
Wow. I wouldn't want to get on their bad side. So it sounds like life in the rainforest can be pretty dramatic, even for a tiny lizard.
It's a constant struggle for survival. They have to compete for resources, avoid predators, find mates, all while navigating this really complex and ever-changing environment.
Which brings us to a topic that's been weighing on my mind a little bit, the threats facing the Bay Island Anole. We've talked about how well adapted they are to their environment. But even the most adaptable species can struggle when their habitat is threatened.
Absolutely.
Hmm?
And sadly, the Bay Island Anole, like many island species,
Mm.
is facing some pretty significant challenges because of things like habitat loss, invasive species, and the looming threat of climate change.
Let's start with habitat loss. What are the primary drivers behind this threat?
Well, one of the biggest culprits is deforestation, which is mainly driven by agricultural expansion and development projects. As forests are cleared for farmland or construction, the anole's habitat shrinks and becomes fragmented.
Right, so it's not just about the overall amount of habitat that's lost, but also how that loss is distributed. Can you explain how habitat fragmentation impacts a species? Like the Bay Island Anole?
So imagine a forest as like a network of interconnected paths. As humans carve up the landscape, those paths get broken. And that isolates populations of animals and disrupts their ability to move freely, find food, and mate.
So it's like dividing a once thriving community
Yeah.
into all these isolated pockets, making them more vulnerable to threats. That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. And it's not just deforestation that's fragmenting their habitat. Development, particularly along the coast, is also a significant concern.
I can imagine how coastal development,
Mm.
like building resorts or infrastructure, could really impact the species that relies on both forest and coastal vegetation.
You're absolutely right. It's a classic case of human activities disrupting these delicate ecological balances. And then on top of habitat loss, we have the issue of invasive species.
Can you tell me more about that? How do invasive species threaten the Bay Island Anole?
So invasive species are plants or animals that aren't native to an area, and they can often outcompete or prey on native species. It's like introducing a new player to a game. Without explaining the rules, it can really throw things off balance.
So what kind of invasive species pose a threat to the Bay Island Anole? Are we talking about like fierce predators
Yeah.
or aggressive competitors?
Well, one example is the brown basilisk, which is a larger lizard species that's not native to the Bay Islands. It's been spreading really rapidly, and it's a pretty voracious predator. It's actually known to prey on anoles.
So not only are these invasive species competing for resources, they're also directly preying on the Bay Island Anole.
It's a double whammy.
Exactly. And preventing the introduction and spread of invasive species
Uh,
is absolutely crucial for protecting the anole.
And other native wildlife.
It sounds like a really complex challenge. With all these multiple threats converging on this little lizard, it makes you wonder, what hope is there for the Bay Island Anole in the face of all this?
Well, it's definitely a lot to take in.
Yeah.
But I think knowing the threats is the first step to finding solutions.
Okay, so you're saying it's not a lost cause. What can we actually do to help the Bay Island Anole, given all of these challenges?
It's definitely not a lost cause. There's actually a lot we can do, both on a large scale and as individuals.
Okay, I'm ready for some good news. What are some of the most effective strategies for protecting the Bay Island Anole and its habitat?
Habitat preservation is key, and that means like expanding and strengthening protected areas on the Bay Islands.
So creating safe havens where development and deforestation are restricted.
Exactly. But it's not just about creating those areas, it's also about actively managing them. And that involves things like monitoring wildlife populations, controlling invasive species, and restoring habitats that have been degraded.
So it's an ongoing effort, not a one-time fix.
Exactly. Conservation is a long game. It requires constant vigilance
Yeah.
and, adaptability.
You mentioned controlling invasive species. What does that actually look like in practice? Do we send in teams of lizard wranglers
Yeah.
to capture brown basilisks?
It can get pretty hands-on. Sometimes it does involve physical removal, but it also includes things like biosecurity checks at ports to prevent new introductions from happening in the first place.
So stopping the problem at the source as much as possible?
Exactly. Prevention is always better than cure, especially when you're dealing with invasive species.
It sounds like a lot of this work happens on the ground, involving local communities and organizations.
Absolutely. Local communities are really at the forefront of conservation efforts.
Yes.
Their knowledge of the land and their commitment to protecting their natural heritage is invaluable.
It makes sense to involve the people who live closest to the species
Yeah.
and understand its needs the best.
Right, and it's about empowering these communities, providing them with the resources and support they need to manage their natural resources sustainably.
So it's not just about protecting a species, but about helping the communities that coexist with it to thrive as well.
Exactly. It's about finding solutions that benefit both people and the environment.
All this talk about these large-scale conservation efforts is really inspiring.
Yeah.
But it also makes me wonder, what can I as an individual do to help the Bay Island Anole?
Never underestimate the power of individual actions. Even small changes can make a difference.
Okay, so give us some concrete examples. What can our listeners do right now to contribute to Bay Island Anole conservation?
Spreading awareness is a great start. Talk to your friends and family about the Bay Island Anole. Share information online. And just help amplify the message about the importance of conservation.
So it's about educating ourselves and then sharing that knowledge with others.
Exactly. The more people who know about the Bay Island Anole and the threats that it faces, the more support we can build for conservation efforts.
What about supporting conservation organizations? Does that actually make a difference?
Absolutely. There are many organizations out there that are working tirelessly to protect the Bay Island Anole and its habitat, and your donations, no matter how small, can really help fund research, conservation programs, and community outreach.
It's a good reminder that even a small financial contribution can have a real impact.
For sure. And don't forget about being a responsible tourist. If you ever visit the Bay Islands, choose eco-friendly accommodations, support local businesses that prioritize sustainability, and just be respectful of the natural environment.
So it's about making conscious choices that minimize our impact on the environment, even when we're on vacation.
Exactly. Every decision we make as consumers and travelers has an impact.
We've covered a lot of ground today. From the really intricate details of the Bay Island Anole's life to the very complex challenges it faces, it's been a really eye-opening journey. And I have to admit, I'm feeling a mix of concern and hope.
I understand. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of these problems, but it's important to remember that we can make a difference. Every action we take, no matter how small, contributes to a larger solution.
That's a really powerful message to end on. We've learned about the Bay Island Anole's remarkable adaptations, the delicate balance of its rainforest home, and the urgent need for action to protect this really unique species. It's been a fascinating deep dive, and I hope our listeners are feeling inspired to learn more and get involved.
I hope so too. The future of the Bay Island Anole, like the future of so many species, really depends on our collective efforts.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. into the world of the Bay Island Anole. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the wonders of science and nature.